Do you do business internationally? Do you sometimes get frustrated when you're communicating with somebody and, man, it's hard because you just don't understand exactly what's going on? Are you in an environment maybe where you speak English as a second language and now you're negotiating with somebody else in English as a second language? You know, in today's world, so much of the communication that takes place happens over email. There's so many opportunities to misunderstand each other, particularly now if we do this in a cross-cultural context. Do you find yourself frustrated sometimes by sitting across the table from folks and not really understanding what's going on? Well, I want to shed some light in this video clip for you on some of the things that you can do to take away the pain that is associated often with cross-cultural negotiations, to help you shorten the negotiation cycle. Often cross-cultural negotiations can take on a dimension where it just sucks up time and resource because it's so difficult to properly understand what's going on. My name is Jan Podgieter, and over the past 13 years I've had the opportunity to train more than 8,000 people face to face. These people represented some of the world's biggest companies, well-known brand names. I've worked with some of the biggest brands in the world, part of the Fortune 500, the FTSE 100 type organizations. I've done so in 46 countries. I've negotiated face-to-face with folks, with about 3,000 people on camera, and I've consulted to many multi-billion-dollar organizations or transactions, I should say, in North America, Europe, Asia, etc. I tell you this because I want you to know that I can bring you perspective. It's not to impress you with my experience, but just I want to emphasize that I can bring you perspective. I've seen how folks approach negotiations in different parts of the world, in different industries, in different functional disciplines, and hopefully that experience that I've gained can deliver some value to the way that you want to approach your negotiation. So when it comes to cross-cultural negotiations, today's business world, well, let's face it, it's not going to get less culturally complex, is it? With the advent of the internet, with the removal of the boundaries and restrictions on the time associated with traveling, because with airplanes we can get just anywhere now. This cross-cultural thing is not going to go away. It's just going to get bigger. We have the rise of Asia. We have the juggernauts. India, China, Brazil, Russia. The global landscape is forever changing and evolving. If you're not negotiating cross-culturally now, odds are pretty good you are going to be negotiating cross-culturally pretty soon. The makeup of our societies have also changed. Even in the country that you live in now, there'll be foreigners living in those countries. There'll be people who were born in different cultures working, in your organizations, in your teams. So this is an issue that we often encounter, particularly when you're working with large global organizations. So there are a couple of key concepts here that you want to get on top of when you consider negotiating in a cross-cultural context. One is that there is so much that has been written on negotiating cross-culturally or the way that people communicate depending on the culture that they're in. It's almost impossible to extract anything that has utility value in a short space of time. It's been such an academically approached topic. And listen, there's some great stuff. If you're really interested in this topic, go get the stuff written by Hofstede, the Dutch academic, and he was a pioneer in this area. Also, von Strompenaars, another Dutch pioneer in this area. I've had the opportunity to meet with them, but they have fascinating insights, and you can get a really good angle on some of the research and the science that sits behind this. But if you're doing business today with somebody, let's say from China, tomorrow somebody from Australia, the day after somebody from Italy, followed by somebody from Saudi Arabia, you don't have the time to go and examine all these academic studies and see, okay, how do I set up and how do I treat this specific culture? I mean, and it depends by whose measure you judge it and when it is, but there's anything between, let's say, 190, 200 to 250 different countries, depending on, who secedes from where and who joins up. There's something like, I think it might be even 5,000 languages or dialects in the world. There's so many different cultural groups, subsets. How do you make sense of all of it? Well, In a purely business context, so I'm not talking about a social context necessarily. In a purely business context, what you want to do is you want to think about whether, if you're contrasting your own cultural background with another cultural background, you want to consider whether the focus is on the content end or whether it's on the context end of the spectrum. Let me explain those two in a bit more detail. If you're thinking content, it means, the contract governs the relationship. So if you and I enter into an agreement, something goes wrong, then I pick up the phone or we have a discussion. I say, well, hang on, let's look at the agreement. What was it that we agreed? That agreement governs the way that we're going to manage the relationship, right? So this is an approach that's favored in places, in Western Europe and North America. Generally speaking, a content-driven approach is something that's favored in areas where there's quite a mature legal system and a mature financial system in place. Because of course, if you have a mature legal system, we have references to case law that goes back many years, and so we can predict fairly, how a judge would decide based on that contract, who's going to be winning and who's going to be losing the case, and therefore, we're happy to submit ourselves to the governance of the contract, if you will. Now, if we look at some of the emerging economies, in those environments, there's not a very stable and mature legal system in place. There's not a very stable and mature financial system in place. We know, and I won't mention specific countries, but we know in some countries we can equally predict what the judge is going to decide. And if you're from Western Europe or North America, I can safely predict it's not going to find in your favor, right? So the contract all of a sudden doesn't have that much value, So if we have a disagreement or things go wrong, and things inevitably go wrong, I think we always think that we only negotiate when we make a deal, but of course you negotiate when you manage a deal, and you negotiate when you mend a deal, because things go wrong. Life carries on, things change. So negotiation is not just a once-off event; it's a process. Now, if you're in this environment where there's a focus on context because the legal system is maybe not that mature, the financial system is not that mature, now you've got to manage the way that you approach that negotiation significantly differently to the way that you negotiate in a content-driven society. So to give you an example, I'm based in the UK at the moment. If I go to the States, if I want to go do a deal, if I travel from London to New York to go negotiate a deal, I can quite happily take my accountant, my lawyer with me. We can get on the plane, and we can arrive in New York in the morning. We can go straight into the meeting, me with my accountant, my lawyer. We can sit down, for an hour or two. We can do the deal. I can genuinely, leave straight afterwards, go back to the airport, get on a plane, return to London. Now that's not going to work if I'm doing business, let's say in China or in South Korea or in Japan, where there's more focus on the context. So Japan, as their economy has matured, they've become much more content-driven over the past 10 or 15 years or so. But now when we get to some of these more context-driven environments, now we're probably going to cause huge offense if I show up for that first meeting with my lawyer, with my accountant, because of course now we have to establish the relationship first before we enter into an agreement. Because think about it, if we don't value the contract as the primary thing to govern the relationship, because it's not culturally part of how we do things, now it's more important for me to foster the relationship. There's also an impact on the way that we think about time. So often in the West, we really focus on doing things now. We think in the dimension of now, whereas in some cultures they think far into the future. If we establish a relationship, it's not just for now. Point is this, without getting too much focus on the detail behind it, is that you need to understand where you're doing business. Is the focus going to be on content, or is it on context, or is it going to be on content? If the focus is going to be on context, don't lead with the content. Lead with the context. So focus on establishing the relationship first. If the negotiation is a content-driven environment, if you're going to go do business in Germany or in the UK or in the United States, focus on the content first. The relationship will follow. So once you've delivered, once you've complied with what was required, well, then the relationship will follow. So keep in mind, I'm talking about within a business context, not a social context. So you've got to consider which end of that spectrum you want to focus on. There are lots of other little things that you might want to consider, which is outside of the context of what I can achieve in a few minutes on camera here. But primarily, first point of departure that you need to consider is, am I getting ready to negotiate from a perspective of context or content. And then you focus there. Interesting thing for you to consider maybe. Often, if you come from a content-driven society, you think that focusing on the content might be quicker than doing all this contextual stuff. But that's not true, because once the relationship's in place, once that trust has been established, the agreement follows with ease. In the content-driven environment, the lawyers and the accountants spend loads of time picking that agreement apart. And that often results in taking about exactly the same amount of time in getting to agreement. So it's not that one is better than the other, it's just different. And we need to make sure that we approach that process from a perspective that we can optimize the results. This way, you're going to significantly shorter the time it takes to reach agreement, right? Because if you just focus on the content, they just focus on the context, you're communicating at cross purposes, takes longer, right? So just keep in mind where it is that you're going to negotiate. Here's the other rule of thumb. If they're coming to you, they need to do it your way. If you're going to them, you need to do it their way. So just a common courtesy. So think about a couple of those things. Hopefully that provides you with some insights into how to optimize your cross-cultural negotiations. Here's to your continued success, and thank you for watching.